So, okay, so first of all, Happy New Year. It's quite something on a Saturday evening on a New Year's Day. You're trying to learn some mathematics, so it's very good. It's a good augur for the next year. So Happy New Year to all of you, and hope for all the best for the new year. Finish your PhDs if you can this year, 2022. Anyway, so any questions so far? What we had? Does anyone have questions about what we've been doing? Okay. Basically, the proof of the Riemann mapping theorem. And I believe in the last lecture, I think Professor Nitsure had also used this business about uniform boundedness and whatever. Okay. Models, normal families and something like that he had said. Yeah. So anyway, you can see that there are ideas that sort of are common to lots of different areas. Okay, any questions? No questions? Yes questions? No? No questions. Anyone want to ask anything? Okay, so today I sort of hope that I will do a very crash kind of course on Fourier analysis. And as usual, I believe that Fourier analysis is one of those subjects that is taught as a full course in one of the later AFSs. I think AFS 3, they have a course on Fourier analysis. And I think all of you also know that Fourier analysis is very important. And however, we'll be sort of seeing a bits and pieces of this Fourier analysis. And I will not be proving this Paley-Wiener theorem, but instead of that, I want to do something else, okay, which would be related also to the other course I'm teaching, which is on zeta functions. So I want to talk about zeta functions, classical zeta functions. And again, here Stein and Shakarchi do a really very interesting approach to zeta functions, theta functions, gamma function, okay, which let's see, after this, there'll be only 4 lectures remaining, so I'm not sure how much I'll be able to do, but anyway, it's worthwhile. Hopefully, people will be interested enough to read something more about it from the book, okay? And let's see how far we go. Obviously, there'll be some changes along the way, but let's see. Okay, so let's start, okay? Yeah, this has the red screen, you should be able to see it. So the Fourier transform, first 22, Happy New Year. So if f is integrable, which means that integral mod f dx is equal to norm f1 is finite, you can define f hat at psi by that particular integral, okay? And that integral is convergent, the first statement, okay? And first of all, you will see that mod f hat psi, you take the absolute value inside, x and psi are both real, and therefore mod f hat psi is less than equal to norm f1. So the Fourier transform of any function in L1 is bounded. Okay, so this is the first statement that one makes. And notice that here itself there are some problems, because the question is, what is the image of the Fourier transform? Okay, even if you take f in L1, the question is, how can you characterize the image of functions in L1 under the Fourier transform? And this is surprisingly difficult to do, okay? Of course, you can say something about denseness and this, that, and the other, but the question is that how do you characterize all those G's which are f hat for some f in L1 of R? Okay. Turns out to be not that easy to do. So I'm not sure even if it has been done. Okay. Anyway, so this is the definition of the Fourier transform, and obviously it makes sense for all kinds of functions. For example, if you have a function with compact support, continuous function with compact support, okay, then it is integrable, and therefore you can define this. Okay, and all of you know that calculating Fourier transforms are important. Okay. Probably you don't quite realize that what we are doing here is something to do with this e to the minus 2 pi I x psi. Okay. And the point here is that if I call that e raised to, yeah, so I should also say this. This is the way that the Fourier transform can be defined. Okay. There are other ways of defining the Fourier transform also, in which you get different constants out. For example, you might want to put a 1 over root 2 pi in the front and then change that e raised to minus 2 pi I x psi, drop the 2 pi. Okay. These kind of things you may want to do. Okay. And whenever you're trying to read something about the Fourier transform, you have to be slightly careful about what is the normalization. Okay. Is there a constant 1 over 2 pi or 1 over square root of 2 pi in front of that integral? Is there a 2 pi I? Is there a 2 pi inside that exponential? Okay. And the point is that if you don't put these 2 pi's and 1 over root 2 pi's or 1 over 2 pi, okay, that is going to be the Fourier transform up to a certain scaling. Okay, and one has to be careful of what the scaling is. So whenever you're reading any book, okay, be careful about how the Fourier transform is defined. What is the normalization for the Fourier transform? Okay, is there a 2 pi? Where is the 2 pi coming? Why is the 2 pi coming and not coming in various places? Okay, so these kind of things you have to be slightly careful about when you're talking about what the Fourier transform is. Okay, and the most glaring example of this was in one of these public exams. I won't tell you which. They say the Fourier transform of this particular function. They gave a function. They said the Fourier transform of this particular function is, and they gave 4 answers. Okay. And whoever the paper setter was, whoever the paper setter was, he did not realize that the Fourier transform can be defined in many different ways, depending on where you put constants. Okay. So it was not quite correct for such a question to be asked. Anyway, so this is the Fourier transform, and what most people do not emphasize is that, you see, there is something special about that e raised to minus or e raised to plus 2 pi I x psi. So remember, the function, the variable in the function is x. Psi is supposed to be the Fourier variable. And there are various ways of talking about this. X you can think of as time, t, and psi is supposed to be the frequency. Okay. So if you're talking about signals, then you have time and frequency. X plays the role of t, which is time, and psi plays a role of frequency, which is omega. Okay. So there are various ways of talking about it. Let's not worry too much about all the words that you associate with this. But the point is that e raised to minus 2 pi I psi x, I should actually be writing it as not e raised to minus 2 pi I x psi. I should be writing it as e raised to 2 pi I psi times x. Okay, because x is the variable over which you are integrating. Doesn't really matter, but there's a point of understanding that. I've written it correctly here. So look at this chi psi. Look at this function chi psi. For each psi in real numbers, I'm looking at the function chi psi. Chi psi is a function from real numbers. And where does it take values? It takes values in t, the unit circle. Okay. So chi psi is from real numbers with addition to unit circle with multiplication. I've not written that down. Okay, on T, the group structure is multiplication. So chi psi is a map from R to R plus to T with multiplication, and chi psi is a homomorphism. Okay, so for each psi in R, I have this map chi psi, which is a homomorphism from R to T. Okay, so I have a map from psi, I have a map from R. Okay, for each psi, I have a map from R, which will give me chi psi, which is a homomorphism. That's clear. Now, chi psi of x1 plus x2 is chi psi of x1 times chi psi of x2. And this map chi psi as a function from R to T is a homomorphism. That's immediately clear. And it is continuous. That is also immediately clear. Okay, chi psi is a continuous function from R to T. What is not very obvious is that every continuous homomorphism from R to T has to be of the form chi psi for some psi in R. Okay. So what I'm trying to tell you is that this chi psi is a homomorph for each psi in R. Chi psi is a continuous homomorphism from R to T. Okay. So for each psi, this is a continuous homomorphism. And what is not that easy is that every continuous homomorphism from R to T is of the form chi psi for some psi in R. Okay. You know, if you remove this condition that this homomorphism must be continuous. So the question is that, are there discontinuous homomorphisms from R to T? Or maybe I should phrase that slightly differently. Are there homomorphisms from R to T which are not continuous and which may not be continuous? Has anyone thought of that? What should I do now? I should probably go here. Are there discontinuous homomorphisms from R to T? Any idea? For example, can I say that, let me change the question slightly. Are there measurable homomorphisms from R to T? What do you think the answer to that will be? I mean, that are not continuous. Obviously, if it's continuous, it is measurable. Okay. So are there non-continuous measurable homomorphisms from R to T? And what do they look like if there are? Has anyone thought about this?
No, sir.
So you think there aren't, or you haven't thought about it?
No, I haven't thought about it.
Ah, so this is actually an interesting question, that how do you, first of all, the first statement I'm making is that every continuous homomorphism from R plus to T with multiplication has to be of the form chi psi. This is this statement actually is a statement that comes in a measure theory class. Okay, because the moment it is continuous, you can prove that that homomorphism has to be measurable. Sorry, the moment it is continuous, you can prove that that homomorphism must be differentiable. And once you have a differentiable map, it is easy to show that it has to be of that kind. So continuous implies differentiability, implies it has to be of that kind for homomorphisms from R plus to T. Okay, but the question is that are there discontinuous ones? Are there measurable maps? And again, this question is quite interesting, and you should sort of think about it a little bit. So I'm sure I'll be very surprised if you have thought about it. But anyway, someone want to say something, or this is a random noise? Roshni, you wanted to say something?
Yes, sir.
What?
Sir, we encountered this question that the number of total continuous maps from R under addition to S1 under multiplication are of the form e raised to 2 pi I theta, where theta is
theta is
that is what we have did in our topology class. And
just now you've done that? Really?
Yeah, in Nitsure sir's class.
He said that, okay. So he said that every, yes, continue.
Every continuous map from R plus to S1.
Yeah.
Where S1 is under multiplication is of the form 2 pi I x or 2 pi I theta, where theta is an element in integers in Z.
No, you're talking of something else. You're talking about homomorphisms from, no, that is a different statement. Integers to there, integers to T, and T to integers, whatever. The statement you're making is slightly different. The groups are different, okay? But what I'm saying is from R to S1, each chi psi is a continuous map from R to S1. That is easy, okay, that each is continuous and a homomorphism. What is not that easy is that these are all, okay? Any continuous homomorphism from R to S1 has to be of this kind. And I'm going one step further, and I'm saying that are there measurable homomorphisms from R to S1? This is the next statement I'm making, okay?
I at least have not thought about it.
So it's worth thinking about it. So it's an interesting question. Okay. Anyway, the reason I want to say this is because such maps, okay, which are continuous and homomorphisms from R, instead of R, you put any group G there. Okay. Any map from G to T, which is G is supposed to be a group. And as someone said, it's a topological group. And therefore it's a group, and then you have G to T is a group, and then T is a topological group, and then I can talk about continuous homomorphisms from G to T. The set of all continuous homomorphisms from G to T are called the set of characters of G. Okay, and what we are doing here is that we are given a function on G, which is R. Okay, I'm finding the set of all characters of the group, which I'll call the dual group, and I'm identifying the dual group with real numbers itself. Okay, so I'm saying that R hat, which is the set of all characters on R, the dual group of any group is a group. And what I'm telling you is that the dual group of R is isomorphic to R, because chi of psi1 plus psi2 is equal to chi psi1 into chi psi2. Anyway, so the point is that these are all the characters, and character is a continuous homomorphism. And what we are doing is a particular case of finding the dual group, and given a function on the group, I'm defining a function on the dual group. Dual group is my chi-psi. So the Fourier transform is a function which is defined on the dual group, and it's defined to be equal to the inner product of f with chi-psi. And inner product I'm writing in L2, and this is very bad notation because chi-psi is not in L2 and f is not in L2. Okay, that is not a dot, it's the inner product of f comma with chi-psi. Okay, so one has to be slightly careful here about what do you mean by a function on the dual group. So in fact, the Fourier transform is a particular case of, given the function on the group G, I want to define the function on the dual group G hat, where if I take chi in G hat, then f hat of chi is the inner product of f with chi. Okay, and then you will begin to realize that the Fourier transform is the most basic example of representation theory. Okay, this is you might be surprised to hear me say this, but there are people who do representation theory and do not realize that the most basic example of representation theory is the Fourier transform. Okay, so in some sense, all of representation theory has come out of the Fourier transform. Okay, so the point is that I'm defining f hat like this, and what is my little f was in L1, so I could define this. And the trouble is that f hat need not be in L1. Okay, and under what it's bounded, I know, but it need not be an element in L1. Okay, and there's this problem about how do you define it, okay, so that it becomes an isometry. So there is this question of extending the definition of the Fourier transform from some set which is dense in L1, and the obvious dense set you'll take is L1 intersection L2, or you take continuous functions with compact support or something like that. And we want f hat to be an isometry, in fact a unitary map. Sorry, I should say f going to f hat to be a unitary map on L2. So all these things, of course, we don't have time to talk about more carefully, but all that we want to do now is to actually say for some nice set of functions, when I can invert this map. So the first statement is that, first thing I'd like to know is that this f going to f hat is a one-to-one map. Okay, that itself is not easy to see, that if f hat is identically 0, can you prove that f is equal to 0? Okay, so there's something to be done there. Anyway, so Stein-Saccacci are interested in complex analysis, so they'll give you a complex analytic proof of the inversion for a certain family of functions. Okay, and this does not mean that this inversion formula works for every family of functions. Okay, but we are going to introduce a family of functions for which the inversion formula holds. Okay, so this script f sub a are functions that are analytic on strips, horizontal strips of size a, okay, and which are bounded uniformly in the y by 1 over 1 plus x squared. That means that when I integrate it along the y-axis, I integrate it along the x-axis at any height which is less than a, okay, then it will be integral of a over 1 plus 1 over x squared, which the integral is finite. Okay, so I want functions which are analytic in strips of height a, okay, and which are uniformly bounded in y. Okay, for each y, they're uniformly bounded by some constant over 1 plus a x squared. Remember, this thing on the right hand side does not depend on y. Okay, so long as y is bounded, you're within that strip. F on that horizontal line anywhere is bounded by a over 1 plus x squared. F at x plus iy. F is uniformly bounded on every horizontal line, imaginary part of z, equal to constant. For that constant less than a. What are examples? The examples are these are sort of this is the most important example in some sense. Fz is equal to e raised to minus pi z squared. When you put it pi z squared, it'll be the real part of that is x squared minus y squared. So you have minus pi x squared and a minus y squared, which will become a plus y squared. But y is bounded. Therefore, this is bounded by y because y is less than equal to a. Okay, y is less than a. So this kind of functions, anything which looks like x squared minus y squared, the real part looks like that. Okay, is going to lie in this little f sub a. And what is script f? That I introduced. I have introduced it here. If f is in f sub a, then the derivatives lie in f sub b. F is uniformly bounded on every horizontal line, imaginary part of z equal to k for k less than a. If f is in f sub a, the derivatives are in f sub b for all b less than a. You know, I can't put b equal to a here. I can't say that fn is in f sub a. I can say that fn is in f sub b for all b less than a. Okay. For b equal to a, I have problems. And this is an exercise which you should prove the Cauchy integral formula. My God, I'm not going to finish this. If f is in f sub a, then f hat is bounded by b times mod psi. If b is equal to 0, then we already know that this is bounded by L1 norm less than a over 1 plus x squared, which is finite number. If b is greater than 0, then there's a contour integral formula. Okay, so I want to do this for psi greater than 0. I take this particular contour, see what happens. Okay, this is very straightforward to read. All this is there and that. I mean, so all this is there already. Let gz be fz e raised to minus 2 pi I z psi. And remember, if psi is greater than 0, I'm going to put z in the negative part. So the imaginary part is negative. And then I'm integrating in x. Okay, that's what r minus it, this lower part. Look at the lower part integral. Minus r minus it. Then t goes from 0 to b. T goes from minus r to b. That is in this direction. But f at this point is less than a over r squared for some constant. And when you take, I have not put absolute value signs on the right hand side. So you put absolute value signs on the right hand side, take the absolute value inside, and then what you have is 2 pi, the I and the R, okay, that will be imaginary. And then there's an I with the T. So you have minus minus plus, and I will give you a minus sign. And then you get e raised to minus 2 pi t psi, okay, dt. Okay, and you know that this is less than equal to 1 over r squared, some constant. It decays as r squared as r tends to infinity. Similarly, the other part, and therefore you can use Cauchy's theorem for the rectangle. That thing is integrable, and therefore you'll get that f psi. So I should also say the integrals over the vertical paths are 0, are tending to 0. Okay, and therefore you'll get the f hat psi looks like this. Okay, and therefore mod f hat psi. Okay, all that is happening is that this integral from here to here along the x-axis, you're replacing it by the integral along the lower line. okay? And therefore it's less than B psi. So exactly the same thing works on the other side. So the point here is that if f sat is in f sub, if little f is in script f sub a, then f hat psi is exponentially decreasing. See, what is this saying? If f is in f sub a, then f hat psi is exponentially decreasing for any b, which is less than a. So obviously when a is increasing, my b can also go on increasing, so long as b is less than a. Then this gets smaller and smaller, okay? So the point here is that as a increases, f is in f sub a, when a is increasing, you will get this f hat psi is going to decrease exponentially at a faster and faster rate, okay, when psi tends to infinity. And that is an important observation. Okay, this is what is telling you that this is what is telling you that f is decreasing exponentially. Little f is decreasing exponentially when little f is in script f sub a. Okay, f is the union of all the f sub a's. Then integral of e raised to minus xt is equal to 1 over x dt. Okay, whatever it is, this is immediate. And the point is that on this family, on this f, I can invert. Okay, fx is equal to this. Notice that this integral makes sense because f hat, if f is an f, it belongs to some f sub a, and therefore f hat psi is decreasing exponentially. Okay, and therefore this integral makes sense. F hat psi decays, it decays exponentially, so that the integral converges. So what do you do? Again, you use the residue theorem, or you use Cauchy's integral formula. F hat psi, you break it up from minus infinity to 0, 0 to infinity. Look at the 0 to infinity part. Okay. Now what is f hat psi? This is minus infinity to infinity of this, and therefore integral f hat psi e raised to minus 2 pi I x psi from 0 to infinity. You just substitute that back in there. Okay. This I proved in the previous line. And obviously, when you have a double integral, the only thing you do is interchange the two integrals. And then when you interchange the two integrals, you have an integral 0 to infinity of some exponential. But I've just told you that integral 0 to infinity of some exponential is 1 over a plus ib. Okay. And then this 2 pi I will bring out because I like 2 pi i's out. And this is what you have left inside. And that is just f zeta over zeta minus x over the line, lower line. You do the same thing from minus infinity to 0, but you do it over the upper line. Again, the integral over the vertical things are tending to 0, okay? And therefore, this whole thing is just, I can add these two things up, and then therefore you'll get this function f zeta over zeta minus z as a simple pole, and the residue is fx, and therefore you get, by a residue theorem, you get this formula. Okay. So by residue theorem, you get the formula that you need. F zeta, fx is f zeta, zeta minus x. But this first term is this, the second term is that, and therefore you can get the inversion formula. Okay. So and there's a very similar business of, so we have the inversion formula for functions f which lie in this script f. Okay, the Fourier transform decays exponentially, and therefore you can have that the inversion formula holds. Okay. Very good. So, I mean, once you have this inversion formula, then obviously f hat is equal to 0 implies f is equal to 0. Okay, this is a 1-to-1 map for functions which are in FA. it still does not answer the question of, is there an inversion formula for a function f which is in L1? Okay. And the reason you don't have it is because you don't know what the image is like. If f is in L1, f hat is where? Which space is f hat in? And this is not really clear at all. Similarly, if you have one of the other spaces, okay, continuous functions with compact support, what can you say about f hat? For that, there is an answer, okay? And that is what this content of the Paley-Wiener theorem, which I will not do, okay? That is what it actually says, okay? But you'll see. Okay, so we have the inversion, and let me here also tell you that, so we have done the inversion formula. This gives you a proof using residue calculus or Cauchy's integral formula for the inversion formula for the Fourier transform. Okay, when the function is in script f. Okay, it does not tell you what the inversion formula is if the function, for example, is in L2. The question is, how do you define the Fourier transform for a function in L2? Okay, and defining the Fourier transform for functions in L2 is actually important. Okay, all of the current signal processing businesses involve Fourier transforms in L2. The fact that the Fourier transform is a unitary operator on L2 of R. Okay, so if you people have not seen the definition of the Fourier transform for finite abelian groups, how many of you have seen what is the Fourier transform on a finite abelian group?
Yes, sir.
That's like, because you were in Pune University, Datta.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and that too, not everyone in Pune University would have seen it. So, how many of you have seen the Fourier transform on finite abelian groups? No? So if you have not, for example, what is the Fourier transform on Zn? No? Take Zn, integers modulo n. This is a finite abelian group. What is the Fourier transform on Zn? No? Just wait. I want to know if people have thought about this. And this is important enough that you should have thought about it. Yes, Roshni, what are you saying?
No, sir. I didn't even thought about it whether it would even exist or not. I have not much exposure for Fourier.
No, this is one of those things that sort of slips through the MSc. I mean, I was hoping that people would sort of realize that it is important, and very often people don't. That what is the Fourier transform on Zn? The Fourier transform on Zn is called the discrete Fourier transform, finite discrete Fourier transform. And the theorem is that the dual of Zn is Zn itself, and therefore you can talk about the nth Fn, which is the finite Fourier transform at level n. Okay, and again, this is very important in lots and lots of different contexts. Okay, and if you have not seen much about this, okay, if you have not read much about the discrete Fourier transform, finite discrete Fourier transform. Yes, Roshni, you want to say something?
The Z transform.
Z transform is a Fourier transform on the integers Z. Okay, I'm not coming to that yet. I'm talking about so the Z transform is an example of a Fourier transform on a finite, on a discrete, on a abelian group, but the abelian group is Z. So Z is not a finite group. Okay, so the first thing you have to think about is what is the Fourier transform on Zn. Then you know then you have to talk about what is the Fourier transform on Z. The Fourier transform on Z is the Z transform. That's correct. Okay. And of course, what is the Z transform? And then you have the structure theorem for finitely generated, for finite abelian groups. So the structure theorem tells you what the structure of a finite abelian group is. And then you have to prove a theorem which says that if you know this, if you know the Fourier transform on G1 and you know the Fourier transform on G2, then you know what the Fourier transform on G1 cross G2 hat. Because G1 cross G2 hat is G1 hat cross G2 hat. Whatever I mean by that. So anyway, the moral of the story is that if you have not seen this business about the Fourier transform on a finite abelian group, okay, please do read it up. It is important enough that you must understand it. And the best place to read it up is, it's there everywhere, basically. Lots and lots of books on linear algebra, it is there. But one of the places which is written very well, and the basic ideas are covered very nicely, is this book by Audrey Terrace. It's called Fourier Analysis on Finite Groups. Okay, and that book is a really very nice, quite amazing book where a huge amount of mathematics is done. Okay, so Fourier Analysis on Finite Groups, that is the title. If you note it down, you will remember it. Fourier Analysis on Finite Groups by Audrey Terrace, Terras. Okay. So Arnab, that is what you had done at that time when this was done. Someone taught you as a course. Is that right?
No, sir. I had done representation theory of finite groups. Then there was a chapter on Fourier transform.
Okay. So, good. Anyway, so the point is that this has all kinds of connections all over the place, and it's
we considered the class like the set of all functions from Zn to C, and the convolution product on that.
Yeah.
And what is the basis of the that LG function? Those are usual.
Yeah. So the point is that this is the simplest kind of groups that you have, and the question is, what is the definition of the Fourier transform? What is the representation? If you want to talk about it in fancy terms, you say, what is the representation theory for finite abelian groups? Whatever you mean by that. So anyway, if you people have not seen this, please, I would suggest that at least find out something more about the discrete Fourier transform and this business about the Fourier transform on finite abelian groups. Okay, it is worthwhile to read that in any case. So yeah, so where was I now? So I wanted to go back to this. No, this is not what I want to do. I want to go back here. Okay, yeah.
The F you are taking here is from L1R.
I had just said that this is what I'm going to define initially to write down that integral. Okay, I must have that integral converges, makes sense. Okay, and the easiest way to say that it makes sense is that if f is in L1. Okay, but the inversion formula I'm talking about is not an inversion formula for f in L1. It is an inversion formula for f lying in script f. Okay, which is that, you know, it has analytic on that region, on that strip, which is bounded by such and such, okay, uniformly in Y. So the inversion formula is only for those functions. Okay. The inversion formula is going to be true on a much wider class.
Okay.
But I'm not telling you what that wider class is. Okay.
That's an like that forms an inner product space, no? That's why.
What is your question?
Like the functions we had the set from where we are taking the functions.
Yeah.
It forms an inner product space, no?
No. If it's in L1, no. The way that I've defined it is for a function f in L1. The point is that you can extend this definition in a certain manner to make sense for functions f, first of all, which lie in L1 intersection L2. Okay. L1 intersection L2 contains continuous functions with compact support. Okay. And then once you've defined it for L1 intersection L2, then you prove that on this set, the Fourier transform is an isometry. Okay. And therefore you can extend it to be an isometry on the closure of all functions in L1 intersection L2. So there's a way of doing that, and that is not immediately obvious. Okay. So it is actually, that also is actually important. That how do you extend, how do you define the Fourier transform for a function f which is in L2? Okay, and that is where, I mean, once you understand that, then you can show various things about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and the related ideas. But there is something to be done there. Okay, so I mean, Fourier analysis is there as a course in one of the AFSs. If you haven't seen these kind of things earlier, at least see it in the case of a finite abelian group, and even the Fourier transform for a finite abelian group, the fast Fourier transform, the discrete Fourier transform, fast Fourier transform. And then, of course, nowadays everyone is talking about quantum this and quantum that. And then there's something called the quantum Fourier transform, okay, which is at the basis of a lot of quantum computations. Okay, so sometime if you have a chance, you please read that up also. The quantum Fourier transform. The Fourier transform is the same. How do you actually calculate it? That is where the quantum business comes in. Okay, where was I? What do I want to do? I think I want to minimize this. Yes. Okay, so I'm getting out of time. So yeah, I just want to come to this Poisson summation formula and I'll stop. So you look at this particular function. Obviously, it has a simple pole or at z equal to integers. Okay, and the residue at the integers are 1 over 2 pi I. And therefore, if f is analytic, then this particular function has simple poles with residue fn over 2 pi I. Okay, and then the Poisson summation formula says that sum of fn is equal to sum over n and z of fn is sum over n and z of f hat n. Now this looks very nice. Okay, that the sum over all n of fn is sum over all n of f hat n. Okay, and the proof also is a proof using residue theorem. Look at this contour. Okay, this particular function fz over e to the 2 pi I z minus 1 has poles at the integers. Okay, so it has poles at the integers. The residue is given by fn over 2 pi n, a contour nn, and therefore by the residue theorem, okay, the integral of fz over this contour, fz divided by e raised to 2 pi I z, is sum of fn. And when n tends to infinity, this sum is F is decreasing because F was in F sub A. I hope I've written that. F is in F sub A. F is in F, and therefore it belongs to F sub A for some A, and then you write this. Okay, take B less than A. This is decreasing, left-hand side is convergent. Okay, this thing is convergent. By residue theorem, it is the sum of the residues. So decreasing in this, so this is equal to integral of gamma n's. Okay. I'm missing a 2 pi I somewhere out. No, the 2 pi I goes in the residue theorem. Okay. So this is sum of the residues is this. Okay. F is decreasing, left-hand side is convergent. Integrals over the vertical lines tends to 0. Therefore, this sum is integral over L1 minus integral over L2. And what is L1? L1 is the lower line. L2 is the upper line. Something is positive and less than 1 on the lower line. Something is, sorry, less than 1 on the lower line. Something is greater than 1 on the upper line. Okay. In L2, imaginary part of Z is greater than 0. Okay. So, which is L1 and which is L2. L2 is the upper one. Okay. Imaginary part of Z is greater than 0. So this quantity, okay, will become I, and there's an I there. There'll be a minus sign, and Y is positive. So this quantity is less than 1. 1 over x minus 1 is minus summation x to the n. On L1, imaginary part of Z is less than 0. So this is greater than 1. So this is some number that is greater than 1 minus 1. And therefore, I'll pull that e raised to minus 2 pi I out, Z out. And what you'll have is that this is equal to this. And therefore, you just substitute that back in, and you'll get that this sum is, right-hand side is sum of Fn. Please go through this. It's very, very straightforward. Okay. I don't want to spend time there. What I do want to spend time on, the last few minutes I have, is that you take fx equal to e raised to minus pi x squared. Then I have said that the Fourier transform is itself. And then you let g be f at square root of t into x minus a. I'm saying something a bit later on about it, which is what is f of f is e raised to minus pi x squared. So this, when you square this, you get t times x plus a, the whole squared. And then calculate what g hat of psi is. And you should be able to prove that g hat of psi is 1 over root 2 e raised to minus pi psi squared by t e raised to 2 pi I a psi. I'm going to say a little bit more about this a bit later on, just below this. And therefore, Poisson summation tells you this. I substitute for Gn, which is this. Gn. What is Gn? It is e raised to minus pi t x plus n. I mean n plus a squared. This is g hat of n. And then if I define theta of t to be the sum of this, for a equal to 0, we'll get theta of t, put a equal to 0, that is theta of t. And this is t to the minus half theta of 1 by t. So theta of t is theta to the minus half theta 1 by t. That's why I'm doing all this. Okay. And we will understand why I want to do this next week. Okay. There are lots of consequences, very important consequences of the Poisson summation formula. Okay. And you should try to find out. The Poisson summation formula itself is quite straightforward, but it has very interesting consequences. Okay. You just apply the Poisson summation formula and you'll get a result like this. Theta of t is t to the minus 1/2 theta of 1 by t. Okay. So please try to find out at least 2 other interesting consequences of the Poisson summation formula. So what I want to do here, so this G, whatever I've done there, is actually a combination of various statements. I'm trying to separate it out. If you translate F by A, actually I should have put a F x minus A, doesn't matter. You translate F by A, then what does G hat, what is the relationship between G hat and F hat? If you take F and multiply it by an exponential, call that G, what is the relationship between G hat and F hat? If you take F and scale it, Tx, t greater than 0, what is the relationship between G hat and F hat? If you reflect F of minus x, I call Gx, what is the relationship between G hat and F hat? And if you take e raised to minus x squared by t for t greater than 0, what I want you to do is calculate this and calculate this. So e raised to minus x squared was important, you remember? And then I take x squared by t, and then, so this is actually a scaling. Huh? This is e raised to minus x divided by root t, its square. This is the kind of thing that was there here. There's a root t, only there's a root t in the numerator. And when you put a root t in the numerator, I'll get a 1 over root t here. So you calculate this and calculate this. And why am I asking you to calculate this? E. Or Thamba. Okay. And what I think all of you should try and do, please tell me if you can do this, is you take characteristic function of 0, 1. What is the characteristic function of 0, 1? F of x is equal to 1 if x lies between 0 and 1. Take the convolution of f with itself, fx minus t, ft dt. The sum of x minus t and t is x. So I'm asking you to calculate f convolved with f. And once you have calculated f convolved with f, calculate f convolved with f convolved with f. Any ideas what the answer is? Why I'm asking you to do E and F? Where am I? What happens in E and F? E is this business about second derivative of phi and with respect to x and first derivative of phi with respect to t. Why am I asking you to do that?
Because of wave equation.
Wave. Because of
heat equation.
Heat equation. Okay. This exponential business is coming in the heat equation. Okay. So all these ideas are very closely related to each other. Poisson kernel, the heat kernel, and the Gauss-Weierstrass kernel. Okay. So all these ideas, circle of ideas are there. Of course, we don't have enough time to talk about these. But, and why am I, what is the answer to that last bit? Convolution, characteristic function convolved with itself. What do you think the answer should be? All of you have heard about convolutions, I'm sure. Okay. But have you calculated, have you done that calculation? F convolved with F, F is equal to the characteristic function of 0, 1. Has anyone done it? No. Yes or no? No. So please try. And I hope one of you will be able to tell me on Monday what that convolution is. And of course, the heat equation business. I hope you will verify the heat equation business. Okay. So there are these three kernels. One is the Poisson kernel, the Gauss kernel, and the heat kernel. Gauss-Weierstrass kernel and the heat kernel. Okay. So please, there are connections with what I'm talking about with lots and lots of very distinct and very important pieces of mathematics, parts of mathematics. Okay, no one has done that calculation with the characteristic function? No? No one has. Please do it. Okay. Okay, I'll stop now and then we'll meet on Monday.